want to introduce my speaker today, Professor David Kohn. He has been studying Darwin really for the last 40 years. He is the founder and the director of the Darwin Manuscripts Project at the American Museum of Natural History, which is there now. So if your appetite is whet after today, you might want to go see the original documents, the Darwin documents, which are really quite fascinating at the museum. And I did select Charles Darwin for today because this is the week of genius, and I think that while we can debate many people, it's hard to debate that Charles Darwin was other than a genius. And so I think he's a great person to look at today. We're going to look inside his mind and about his character formation. We know so much about origin of the species, but who was Charles Darwin and what really made him tick and made him who he became, which is so important to all of humanity. So without further ado, we'll start, Dr. Kohn, with the fact that he came from actually a family of science in a certain kind of way, which I think people often don't realize. And you see above you Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus, who was a zoologist and biologist, essentially.
Yes, and a physicist and an eye doctor and a poet.
Amazing, actually, right. So at a certain day and age, you could be all of those things, which you couldn't do today. But he was a writer and a scientist in the study that was of those times, which had a lot to do with observation. Absolutely,
and he was a theorist, though, like his grandson. And in fact, one part of this book that he wrote, Zoonomia, The Laws of Life, is in fact an explanation or a theory of evolution. So before his grandson became an evolutionist, his grandfather already was an evolutionist. At least we can recognize him such in retrospect. You could argue that his explanations are not up to snuff quite, but pretty good.
Kind of fascinating. So, but he was, as you said, an eye doctor also, and his son, Charles Darwin's father, Robert, became a physician and was a very revered physician. So if we talk about who was important in Darwin's early life, certainly his father, who's up at the top, who was a very beloved physician, very important in the community. His mother, who is next to the father there, and who was described as very vivacious, very social, well-liked, but sadly died when Darwin was 8.
8 years old, right. So that's a big loss.
Big loss. And actually, I think it's interesting that Darwin's father, Robert, also lost his mother when he was very young.
Oh, so your research has paid off.
So interestingly, this happened, and apparently Charles's father really took the death very hard, and the way that he handled it and the family handled it was essentially to not speak of it, not speak of her, not speak of the loss. They were not really to grieve. And Charles's older sisters became the mothers, essentially. They took care of the home.
And they enforced the no-speak law.
And they said, right, we're not going to speak of this. But really, sort of, they thought for their father, because he was so distraught. It reminded him of the loss of his mother. It was a terrible, terrible loss. And that's important. And that's important because as we talk about Charles, as we go through, this loss was certainly formative in his life. And then we see his wife.
Actually, let's go back to his mother for a second, because the significant thing about her is that she is from the Wedgewood family of Wedgewood, China. And so Susanna is born Susanna Wedgewood. And then Darwin will marry his second cousin, Emma Wedgewood, Edward Darwin née Wedgewood. So this is an inbreeding second cousin marriage, and they're very, very close family ties with the Wedgwoods and a whole circle of and Erasmus, whole circle of independent thinkers who go, they're called the Lunatic Society. Actually, it's the Lunar Society, and they call the Lunatics because they travel to Birmingham by the light of the moon.
Okay.
And have all kinds of scientific and literary discussions in Birmingham. These are people from the Midlands of England, and they are part of the rising gentry middle class of the Industrial Revolution. And the Wedgewoods, of course, you think of it as fine china, but it's dirt, it's earth.
He was a potter.
He was a potter.
And while they weren't maybe economically that incredibly astute, they had some ups and downs in their economic history. The pottery that he did was very innovative for the time. And I think that that's notable because really, if you think about it, both sides of Charles Darwin's lineage was very innovative, creative in different areas, in science and in this pottery, in this sort of artistic, creative way. A lot of somewhat out of the box creative thinking. And I think that he was surrounded by that. And that
you
obviously...
call it the chemistry of creation.
The chemistry of creation,
yeah.
Yes. And that really became, I think, important. However, even though that was the model for what was going on, Charles Darwin's father really wanted him to be a doctor, to follow in his own
family
footsteps.
Tradition.
Family tradition. Grandfather, father, you should be a doctor.
And elder brother, also doctor.
Right. So he basically sent him to school to become a doctor, but Charles really was not too interested in medicine.
He liked following his father around before he was sent to medical school in Edinburgh, going on because he was making his calls, not by taxi but by buggy, and he liked observing his father practice. But when he went to Edinburgh Medical School, other things drew him, and he was repulsed by, he had misfortune, I guess, of trying to learn medicine 20 years before the discovery of anesthesia.
Right. So the suffering of others was very disturbing to him. He was very sensitive, as actually was his father, in a way. He was really bothered by the suffering of others. And I think it's also interesting to note that both father and son had a phobia of blood. Which you would think, and how would you be a doctor? But in those days, short of bloodletting, which was a treatment, if you didn't do that, which apparently Robert Darwin did not, then there wasn't a lot of blood. And that's interesting to note because phobias run in families. They are somewhat genetic, and they often go along with anxieties of other sorts. And so as we move along, we'll see that actually Charles probably was somewhat biologically predisposed to being an anxious person, to having an anxiety disorder, having some fears and so on, and that medicine might have been somewhat anxiety-producing for him, but certainly he was sort of just not interested.
Yeah, but there's the other side, which is interesting in regard to what you're saying. He does become fascinated with natural history, so with the biology, if you like, if not the practice of medicine, while he's in England, in Scotland. And really, that's where he gets his first exposure to evolution, except from his grandfather. There are some radical evolutionists in Edinburgh, but also a lot of... Well, he becomes a member of a natural history society. He actually published his first paper. He has a mentor who happens to be also inclined to radical thinking, like as evolution was. So would you say maybe, I hate to use a word that I don't know the meaning of, but what the heck, displacement?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can't stand the blood of biology, but I love the biology.
But I love the biology.
I love nature.
He loved the science. He had great curiosity. And that is an important feature in terms of being a scientist. Of course, he was very curious about many things. He liked to read. He was an avid reader.
Absolutely.
And his father was terribly disappointed that he did not want to become a doctor, but he tried to please his father, which was an ongoing phenomenon. He really wanted to please his father, who could range from being warm when you did things his way to being downright cruel and having angry outbursts. He once wrote his son, you're never going to amount to anything. You will be a grave disappointment to this family.
Yeah, you read that, it's so destructive.
So destructive,
Yeah.
so cruel. Something that seemed to happen really more after the death of his wife, after the loss of Charles's mother, that he suffered depressions, and they would come out in this short-tempered sort of way. But to please his father, he said, okay, I'm not going to be a doctor, I'll be a clergyman. I will be a man of God. And he went to Cambridge to study religion, and it wasn't as good as being a doctor as far as his father was concerned, but he was okay with that.
I might not put it exactly that. Of course, his father was quite irreligious, not religious, as was the grandfather. His mother probably was religious, as is his wife. But anyway, he goes to Cambridge, and he really was there as an undergraduate.
Yes.
He was exposed to a minimal amount of theology. And if he had stayed on, instead of, as he does, go off on the Beagle, a voyage for 5 years around, if he had stayed in Cambridge, that's when he would have learned his theology and
So this was just the earliest stages of...
Pre-div, if you like.
Okay.
Pre-divinity and more exposure to biology. You couldn't study biology per se.
Right.
So, you couldn't get a degree for another 5 or 6 years. He keeps on missing these things, but he had a very close relationship with the professor. Mentorship is really an important part of Darwin's life.
Yes.
He has a close relationship with the professor of botany, himself an Anglican minister, but he was called the man who walks with Henslow because he went everywhere, all over, tramping around the fields and fens around Cambridge.
But one thing that it seems important, at least in his, whatever his thoughts may have been about religion and first going in that direction, is that he did have some conflict about ultimately what he would begin to think and scientifically look at and study, that he had some guilt, let's say, about going against the theology of the time. Certainly, I mean, it was a big deal to say, no, the Earth is, much older than 7,000 years, and these things were not purely the hand of God, and and in fact, I think he referred to himself at a time as the devil's chaplain.
A devil's chaplain, yes.
A devil's chaplain.
Right.
So that clearly he had some discomfort about who would be upset, angry. This is him with his young sister. They were both young at the time of the mother's deaths, and they were taken care of by the older sisters. And Joseph Priestley, who was...
the man who discovered oxygen, and who was in this circle with Erasmus, and is a dissenter. We should mention that, especially when talking about religion, that the mother side, the Wedgewood side, were Unitarians, not Anglicans, or not Church of England. And Priestley was a dissenter, and he was practically killed by a mob. But I put them two together because you notice that they're painted, these two paintings by the same woman, a beautiful piece of artistry. This proves the worth of the internet, because I didn't realize that until I started looking for a painting of Joseph Priestley and found that, wow, it's by the same artist who did this beautiful painting of Charles, who has a pot of flowers. The pot definitely must have come from his father's ample garden and greenhouses, and but they're in the same circle. You can talk about the Darwins really being part of a Wedgewood circle.
And that also part of the growing up was studying nature as a child. That he loved to collect things. Something not that unusual for boys to make collections of something. But in his case, it was pretty intense, his desire to collect, label, organize, and you could say a little obsessive, a little...
There's no little about it.
Okay, I was being kind. But yes, he was obsessive. But it was rocks, it was, plants.
Right.
And he also liked to hunt and shoot. birds, and which is kind of interesting, but that was also a big part of his upbringing and something that brought him a lot of pleasure, a lot of joy. So that also the focus on
and also
nature.
writing to the girls, you know, the various what do they call them, shootables. He was a shootable, somebody who the girls in the neighborhood, the gentry, could catch possibly.
Okay. I see.
And it didn't quite happen, but yeah, he's a collector. And I could have put another picture here of Darwin. I think it's at the age of about 12, with his first scientific notes, and he is recording the numbers of peonies in his father's garden book, and tabulating them for 2 or 3 years. And that goes on.
He grew up in a beautiful home. I mean, they were you know, well enough off, and so a lot of this collecting happened on the grounds, being outside. But
and behind him, of course, is the garden, which goes. I'm going like this because it goes down to the bank. It's the bank of the River Severn. So he's literally a Shropshire lad.
Yes.
Right across the river is Wales.
Prophetic, though, in terms of...
going too fast.
Oh, sorry, I'm coming back. There we go. Prophetic in terms of his, you know, what he would go on to do, that he, you know, did this really in boyhood.
Yeah. I guess I had this picture in because that's a tree, an apple tree, a variety of apple that probably was in his father Robert's garden. It's a variety that had been just created, and there's a whole issue about the length of life of apple trees in you know, late 18th century. He would have had one of the few new varieties that were trying to escape the apparent death of varieties after a fixed period of time. And something Darwin grew up with, and it actually penetrates into his scientific theory, figures later almost amazingly. You kind of smell the apple, and here it appears while he's on the Beagle, when he's beginning to think about extinction.
So he, and also I think it's important to understand that while his sister, there was this conflicted relationship with the sisters. On the one hand, they were mothers to him. On the other hand, they had informed him, you know, we're not to speak of actually your mother, who you lost. But he also said they were critical. They would comment on everything. And so he says in his autobiography, you know, I would think before I came into the room when one of them would be there, what are they going to say to me now? What kind of criticism am I going to get now? And then he would try to say to himself, well, I will make myself not care. I will make myself immune as I go into whatever they might have to say to me. And that becomes important, really, in a style of thinking, because he goes on to, of course, say a lot of things that a lot of people might criticize.
He's protecting
He's protecting himself. He's very sensitive. The criticism obviously does wound him terribly, but he tries to find ways to protect himself. But also, it bespeaks a bit of a sort of oppositional, defiant, you know, I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm going to find my way to do it, even if you don't like it, which is something that ultimately, scientifically, he did go on to do, but it kind of started early on with this, you know, I'm going to walk in, if I don't look the way you want me to look, if I'm sloppy, if I'm whatever, in terms of my sisters, well, too bad, I'm going to do what I want to do. And I think that becomes prophetic as well. But also in terms of character style, he's very humble. People really like him. They like him when he's young. They like him when he's older. He's very affable.
Nice guy.
Nice guy, nice guy. So nice that, I mean, and a lot of this has to do with this humility that he's got, right? Mm-hmm. He's always wanting to not appear to be bragging in any sort of way, to appear very modest, and he is modest. He really doesn't, in many ways, tout his work. But any time that he had the thought to himself, and he talks about this also in his autobiography, of vanity, of, well, you know, I do want to be noticed. I kind of do want to be recognized. It would make him very guilty. And he had this ongoing conflict.
And there is definite ambition. I mean, a lot of ambition.
A lot of ambition.
A lot of strategy in his present self-presentation, or his ideas anyway. Yeah,
right,
I
so
mean,
when we say he wanted to be noticed, I mean in a big way, right? He wanted to be
ultimately, yeah.
Ultimately, really a kind of a famous scientist to be.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it emerges almost like instant coffee and water as soon as he gets on the Beagle. And there's no brief for him to be on the Beagle. There's nothing he has to do. And yet within the first stop, he has decided that he is going to write the geology the entire continent of South America. It's not been done, and he has a clue, and he's seen one formation, and he thinks he's figured it out. So now suddenly he has a vocation.
Right.
Which he ultimately did do. Of course, it was far less important than what he would, eventually do. But.
Well, so his father was actually quite happy when he got this invitation to go on the Beagle, because it was a potential sign, some back and forth.
There's back and forth with his uncle, the Wedgewood, and who sees the value more than the father
does.
Because the father seems to be hung up about the professional. What are you going to be when you grow up? And as I say, a biologist is nothing. It didn't exist. Or a naturalist is more of a hobby. Mm-hmm. But the uncle convinces him, and then he does support. The whole family supports him. And if you see the letters coming back from the Beagle, they're very fond. I mean, mm-hmm. that relationship that we were talking about earlier somehow begins to resolve itself as he becomes a young man.
Well,
or something else happens to it. I don't know.
Or something, right. Well, so interestingly, so he's at Cambridge. He gets invited to go on the Beagle as mm-hmm. the naturalist on this second expedition that the Beagle takes to South America. Mm-hmm. And that is the time that he has really his first anxiety attack, if you will. I mean, he talks about having a lot of separation anxiety. I will be away for 2 years from my family.
And it becomes 5.
And right, but even before he knew that, before he went, he's very anxious, worried about the separation, but not going to give up this opportunity, definitely pushes himself on. I think it's also interesting to note that is the first time that he has a skin eruption. He has these bouts with, is it eczema? What is it? People have wondered, but they always seem timed to some distressing event. Mm-hmm. In that ultimately historians have looked at this and think it looks very psychosomatic. It looks to be, sure. He's a young man. I mean, there's no reason why he should be suddenly having a skin disorder, but he does, and he has this outbreak during this time of great separation anxiety, and then it resolves. And then he goes on the Beagle, and he's really fine once he goes, which is typical of separation anxiety. It's an anticipatory anxiety, and then you go do the thing, and you're quite all right. So he was fine. I mean, from a terrible anxiety point of view.
I wonder what you might make of his seasickness.
Right. Well, seasicknesses, motion sicknesses. Yes, he apparently.
He suffered for 5 years. Whenever he's on deck, he's out.
Yeah.
But is there a psychosomatic?
Not really. I mean, it's a disequilibrium between the inner ear and some people are more prone. It's pretty amazing that he stuck it out for 5 years with seasickness, but it clearly felt to him. I mean, he was totally exhilarated on this trip, right? He took all these incredible notes, collected all these specimens, sent specimens home. Mm-hmm. He had really found his element. He was actually very, I would say, psychiatrically well during the time of that trip. Before he'd left, he'd had, along with the anxiety, some mild stomach issues. That's important only because people have wondered if his later stomach issues were something called Chagas disease, which is transmitted via an insect that lives in South America and is viral and causes later on in the infection stomach issues and cardiac issues. But really, his symptoms started before the trip. So even though that had been posited, it looks, again, more likely that his symptoms were psychosomatic symptoms.
Well, but these things could reinforce themselves, right?
They definitely can. I mean, it can be true, both of those things, but certainly he had anxiety, and he talks about it. He talks about the feelings that he had. But on the trip, though he did, as you said, have a lot of seasickness, so we'll go back to his wife, he seemed to do well. And really, it's so fascinating that actually much of his great work, would you say, came really from that trip on the Beagle? I mean, that his initial thoughts and inspirations.
Yeah, well, in a sense, not there is a kind of popular conception that it all happened on the Beagle.
Okay.
And it's just much more interesting and complex story than that. But by the time he has come back from the Beagle, he is really, there's evidence that he is seriously beginning to consider the possibility of evolution as a theory, and when he comes back, by the time he's back, it becomes the framing endeavor of his entire life, is to test the evidence for and against this theory that unites all of biology, and to find explanations that are worthy.
Would it be fair to say that his initial sort of spark of out-of-the-box thinking, which evolution would have been at that time, occurred during that time in the Beagle?
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Okay. A very important factor is his reading The Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell, who is was published just before Darwin left England, and the second volume of which only reaches him while he's in South America. And in that volume, the entire volume virtually is devoted to an analysis of the theory of evolution by Lamarck, and a rejection of it. So while he's finding all these incredible specimens, gigantic mammal fossils, no dinosaurs. He was about 30 miles from dinosaurs in South America, but didn't discover them, but gigantic animals. He is exposed to the clearest explanation of Lamarck in English until the 1920s. And so he's saturated with the thinking about evolution.
So it's a combination of what he sees, what he's sort of observing and identifying and diagramming.
But from a negative perspective, right? I mean, it's being criticized, deeply criticized. So his deepest exposure is of a critique.
A critique.
Which I think sets up, you can see setting up a question, well, can I come up with a better answer? I mean, it sets up the problem.
Yes.
Can I do better than Charles Lyell? Who was he'd never met him until he leaves, but he's his mentor as soon as he gets back.
So it was the milieu which was starting to examine, or at least, as you said, present a problem that would
which he interprets in, it's always framed in terms of his own evidence, what he's seeing. As you mentioned, he's an incredible observer, and so he discovers these animals. Certain problems appear to him about how do they go extinct, and the geology of South America, which he studied, doesn't seem to have changed enormously since their time of extinction. How did that happen? Here's Lyell giving answers and saying evolution no, and yet an exposure to evolution yes. So there's a cauldron of immediacy, immediate environment, and his intellectual,
it has a lot of commonality to other figures that we've looked at. That geniuses, essentially, well, he was an okay student, right? He wasn't a particularly brilliant student. Nobody, stopped him in school and said, "Wow, this kid is really something." So he was an average student, and yet he found high average, intelligent enough. But something sparked a passion.
Right.
It was evident early on. He moves into an environment where there's a milieu of ideas bubbling up, starting to present, as you said, problems or questions, and a conflict.
Well, the way you put that is good, because I would just tweak it a little bit to say about the milieu, that that milieu of traveling around the world and making collections and observations was the perfect one for him, whereas the university was rather imperfect.
Right.
You could get the only way you could be recognized as a student in Cambridge, really as distinguished, would be if you were a mathematician. So
So of the time, that was what was
Exactly.
considered brilliance, and observation was a new
Yeah.
science, essentially.
It's
and-
about the reform, the growth of the sciences. But he certainly is in his favorable environment to intellectually evolve.
Right. So he came back from the Beagle. He's very excited.
Yeah.
He's writing. He's working, and then he decides to get married. He marries, as you said, his second cousin, who is also described as a lovely, lively. Actually, in some ways, it sounds reminiscent of his mother, even though he doesn't have. He has vanishingly no memories of his mother.
Yeah.
He writes about this, that he can.
She's a little less. I think Emma's a little less vibrant.
Vibrant. Than his mother.
She's terrific, solid love affair they have. I mean, relationship. But I don't think she's that.
As vivacious.
Yeah.
Vavoom.
Just looking at those, what is captured in those portraits.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
But, yeah.
But they do have a very solid marriage, and she is very supportive of him,
Yeah.
very supportive of his work, encouraging, and something that he needs. He's, as you said, a nice guy and needs sort of a rock, a stable.
Yeah.
And she also deals remarkably well with somebody who ultimately sort of seems to evolve into an intermittent invalid in certain ways.
Yeah, so definitely.
So he's sick a lot of the time, and nobody can figure out what exactly his sickness is.
Well, that's why we have the 20th century, or the 21st century.
Right. Right. So he's anxious. It seems very repressed. In other words, he doesn't talk about being anxious, but he just presents in this physical way. But his symptoms, which he starts having, actually, upon the birth of his first child, which is
Really?
the first huge responsibility, right? You're a man, you have a family. And right after the birth of his first son, he has what sound like panic attacks. He hyperventilates, he has a feeling of palpitations, he feels like he's going to die. He describes this tingly, sort of depersonalized, weird feeling. He gets these intermittent skin rashes back. He has terrible stomach upset, apparently.
Flatulence.
That's his big complaint, flatulence. Makes it tough to be in a lot of company.
Well, he lives at home. He works at home, but
Right.
he never has to work for a living, quote unquote.
Right.
And he's at home, so maybe
So
it
he
helps.
is at home, it helps, but really what happens to many people who have recurrent panic attacks is that they become afraid of going out into open spaces,
Yeah.
and they do sort of want to stay more at home in the safe environment in case they get those feelings. That's called agoraphobia. It's been postulated that he may have had some of that at times.
I think there's less. There's countervailing evidence now that we know his correspondence much better than when the original biography is written. So he makes frequent trips to London. Before he gets married, he's embedded in London Scientific Society. But even after, it's like 19 miles from Down House to St. Paul's, and as the years go, the train gets closer and closer, and so it's quicker and quicker. But his brother lives there,
Right.
So he's a member of a club, the Athenaeum Club. He goes whenever he feels like it. I mean, I don't really want to contradict what you're saying at all about this, but there is this as well.
Right.
Yeah.
No, so he
both
definitely,
together,
he also clearly has periods. He has
Yes.
periods
Oh,
of
yeah.
feeling
Sure.
quite well, and then other periods. It's not consistent, and that also kind of goes against this idea of Chagas disease, and that, it almost sounds like today's version of like irritable bowel syndrome. When you're highly stressed, you become gassy and your stomach hurts and sometimes you throw up, and that is kind of how he describes the symptoms. But he goes through these periods of feeling very well and always productive. Not whatever's going on, it doesn't seem to stop him, even if he's anxious, even if he's very symptomatic.
Yeah.
He seems to be able to continue to write and produce.
Well, he said of himself that he only worked 4 hours a day. But I don't believe that. I mean, what he means by work is probably, I'm only writing the Order of the Species 4 hours a day, and the rest of the time I'm just doing the science, making the observations.
Yeah.
He's constantly working.
Constantly working.
I mean, there are periods when it gets so bad that I think he is out. He's just sick in bed.
Sick in bed.
But no, not too long. There's Annie, his sister, his daughter.
His daughter, and she sadly dies when
Yes.
she is 10.
Yes.
And that is a tremendous loss for him. He's very adoring of his children. Actually, has 10 children.
Yeah, and this is his unquestionable favorite.
This is what? This was his favorite child.
Unquestionably.
His favorite child, and she dies. And he becomes quite ill after, it's another episode of terrible symptoms. He really doesn't fare well.
So that does parallel to what you were saying about his father and his loss and losses. And this is a period not too much before his own father dies.
Yes.
When there's another.
Yes, they happen in rapid succession.
Yeah.
And he is really, really unwell for a long period. I mean, basically it's referred to as sort of a nervous breakdown. What does that mean? He was very, very depressed. He was very, very anxious. He had a lot of physical symptoms because of those feeling states. But the loss of both, and the loss of a father whom he felt so conflicted about. That on the one hand, he remained till the end of his father's life wanting his father's approval so much, and not commenting on his father's intermittent criticism.
Right.
In fact, his wife does say, my father-in-law was not a nice guy, basically, and that it was very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is a religious question here, but about the death of his father, who was I don't want to call him a free thinker, because that means something different in the Victorian period, but just atheist would be or agnostic. He is concerned about the way his father would have been treated by Orthodox Christianity at the time. He talks about the damnable doctrine of damnation for disbelief. That the recognition that his father would have been treated to that or viewed in that way, and then the loss of the question of the face of nature bright with gladness, just to quote from The Origin. That he also, is very similar to the way he writes about his daughter, it is part of the breakdown in his belief, whatever is left of his belief at that point. He has his own Victorian crisis of belief around his father's death, and I think felt most strongly with Annie's death.
When he lost Annie.
Yeah. I mean, why is nature so cruel?
Right.
That's a big issue for The Origin, for Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection.
How could it
All
be?
that cruelty in nature
Right.
that produces new species, creates a novelty. There's a moral conflict that's personal at the heart of his science.
And there are holes in his theories, and he has difficulty. He holds back in publishing. He has. It's. Let's talk about why he waits so long. I mean, decades he waits to really to.
Depending on how you look at it, it's everything from 10 to 20 years.
And ultimately, he publishes because he feels pressured to really get it out there before somebody else does.
Well, I don't agree with that.
Okay. Well,
I think he was definitely ready, and actually working on it from 1854. The minute he finishes all his work on barnacles, this period of not working is over. He starts with the intent to write and never stops.
Yeah, he becomes incredibly...
For 5 years. And he gets a little pressure about 1856 from Charles Lyell.
Right.
But
you don't think that's the reason? You just think he was ready?
I think it's really complicated. Yeah, I mean, I would love to know if in your study of you find evidence of Darwin being blocked as a writer.
Well, when someone is very symptomatic, in other words, I would say after the death of the father and his daughter, I mean, when you're very depressed, being productive is often blocked in any sort of way. I mean,
being productive is being blocked.
That's right, by depression.
Okay.
I mean, you become what's called psychomotor retarded. It's difficult to concentrate. It's difficult to think. It's difficult to produce much of anything.
Oh, okay,
but that was that wasn't necessarily a long period of time. But there was this very, very long period where he had these ideas and he'd written the ideas, but he didn't publish the ideas.
Right.
And how much of that was conflict about sort of going up against religious ideas of the time,
Sure.
going up against colleagues who disagreed with him?
Scientific respectability is a big
Issue.
issue for Darwin, because there's one person who anonymously published in just the year of the Darwin sort of, the gap really intensifies just the year before, and he's smashed because there's so many problems with his ideas by the scientific community. So Darwin isn't going to let that happen to himself. So that is one aspect. But there are some scientific things that are happening in this period when everybody has assumed, I think until fairly recently, that when Darwin spent 6 years studying barnacles at home, which is in tiniest details of the anatomy and the taxonomy of barnacles, and publishes 2 thick books like that, that's an evasion. But it probably isn't entirely, because what he's doing is observing the amount of variability in nature, which is necessary for his theory to work. And he goes into that period being convinced that there should be a lot of variation in nature, but the published literature, either doesn't record it or denies it. And so I don't think I could think of an issue that needed to be resolved that the scientific community was not offering answers to, because they didn't see it as their problem, that Darwin undertakes to solve by himself. He does in this period. And
so waiting for that to have more ammunition, a greater understanding. One thing that remained a hole essentially, and he knew it was a hole, was this idea of how, essentially Mendelian genetics, the idea that if a bird was born with a longer beak and therefore the better feeder, let's say, and therefore that would be the one to live on, how could that happen without the concept of there being a dominant gene or recessive gene, which is Mendel. And it was happening at a similar time, and Mendel actually did release his data, but it was in Austria in a small community, and
even worse, it was in Moravia.
Right. So messages didn't get around. There was no internet. There was no. So the scientific information really trickled along very slowly. Yeah. So he didn't have access to that.
That's an amazing story, actually. That's all about peas, right? Crossing.
Right.
Well, Darwin crossed peas too, and couldn't get the answer that Mendel
didn't get the Mendelian answer exactly. Yeah. So that remained. So there were holes in it, and he was aware of them, and that may have also delayed his. Hoping that he would come up with answers to some of these questions as he.
It actually trips him up later. He actually does publish a theory, a completely rejected theory. It's Darwin's biggest failure as a scientist, theory of pangenesis.
And after he would have a rejection, this is his home.
Yeah,
we'll go back. That was his.
Want to back up a little bit more?
His family, right here.
We shouldn't neglect Eddie, his other daughter, who is quite a bit younger, and to whom there isn't the same attachment. Yeah.
Yes, the favoritism was something that went on in the family quite a bit. Actually, Charles was not the favored. He was not the favored son. There was an older son. He was supposed to be the doctor. He died.
Yeah. Right. There was
because
one who died.
He was in medical school and he cut himself and he became infected and he died. He was the favorite son. So this kind of who was the favorite seemed to be fairly well known, and Charles did it himself. Although he was purported to be a nice father, let's say.
He was a very good father.
A very good father, a sweet. His children, have very positive things to say about him.
He works at home, right, with the children using the stairs as a slide. They actually have a slide they put on the stairs, and it's about 10 feet from Darwin's pondering the significance of life on Earth. And he puts up a lot. And of course, he recruits them. Many of the kids get
Yes.
recruiters who do go out in the fields and collect primroses and things for him, or look at the orchids.
But he also, it seems to be, right, you could say he recruits them, but it's also, he's sort of passing on his passion for,
absolutely.
for his love of nature, and that's something he wants to include them in. And
This is Down House where he lived from 42 to, he dies in 1882, but the family continues afterwards for a while. And then that's what it looks like today. It's a museum. In fact, one of the things that interests me, we're working on with people there on the reproduction, or what do you say? What's the right word? Rerunning of his own scientific experiments in his garden, to see, to use that as a way to reach out to the public and teach Darwinian way of thinking.
I think it's interesting that he does inspire this love in his children, and they do write about his work somewhat afterwards. And in fact, one of his sons goes on to champion the theory of evolution even more strongly in a way than, I mean, he's not the originator, but he really champions his father's work.
Oh yes, I mean his son Francis becomes his research assistant, and then he becomes his editor. Publishes all his letters, etc.
So what's interesting is that family really is important to Darwin.
Could you go back to this? Yeah, to that one. This is an 1870s back view of Down House, his home, and that's Emma sitting on the lintel there as an adult. She almost looks like, to me, like the portrait from her wedding portrait.
Yes.
And those people around there are all his boys, his sons. I couldn't spot them exactly. And I think that the other woman, there are two other women, one I have no idea who is, but the one sitting down is, I think that is one child who was mentally retarded.
Mentally?
Retarded.
Retarded.
Yeah. Who survived. Can't say for sure. Anyway.
Some of his children, I think, struggled with anxiety as well. So it does seem that there is some loading in the family for anxiety. The back of the house, which...
Yeah, this is his famous, I guess I should say famous if you're a Darwin scholar, sandwalk, which is his thinking path. And every day he would take his constitutional, walk along this path and turn into the woods that he actually had planted, and make a round and mark with a stone how many times he went around. So that's
library. I think it's important, he was an avid reader. He really, he loved reading. He read a tremendous amount, helped him synthesize his thoughts. So something that...
We have almost all of those books that have any annotations, by the way, online now.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
So you can look at them. So, pretty cool.
And
Sorry.
Oh, you don't want to miss that. If it's green, I want it. This is the view from the thinking path over to this field that belonged to his neighbor. But that's probably where the whole idea of biodiversity was born. And his actually doing experiments on how many different species can be maintained in a small area. He starts doing ecological research there.
And of
now
course,
the Beagle Voyage.
The Beagle made this path.
I think you'll find most of the rest of the slides kind of are a revision of his scientific career. So we can say what you want.
This was right. This was where he, came upon. And it surprised him, the number of species, the relationship of the species. He sent home the fossils, he sent home the plants, so that he could continue
That's
his
one
work.
of these fossil, it's a toxodon. You can see these in the museums. Again, I think this one is a giant sloth. So animals that are small now were gigantic in the past. Think about the mammoth is kind of like one of the less extreme examples of the same thing. And this is another one. This is actually shot at the museum, at American Museum of Natural History. This particular animal really gave Darwin a hard time because it's where he realized that there were these big animals, and they're similar animals almost from the same group, at least that's what he thought, the guanacos of southern South America, living there today, but those low hills in the background where he found them, he knows the geology again, and it hasn't changed. So this guy here, the what he calls the mastodon of Port St. Julian, with this long neck, right? It's called big neck in Latin, macrochenia, is one of the places that on the Voyage where the issue comes into of extinction, and how do you explain it, comes into. We've been talking about that before. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Geological map of South America, of the southern tip of South America, hand-colored by Darwin. He's worked out all of these different stripes of color. I've been down there. It's an astonishing diversity of geology. You can see one stripe after another. Very complex.
So part of the luck that the expedition was to a place of such biodiversity.
Yes, and geological diversity.
And geological diversity, and that the geology was starting to be really understood at the time in a different way than it had been before.
Mm-hmm. This is his copy of the New Testament in German. I think about Darwin as a graduate student. The Beagle Voyage is a graduate project. So graduate students typically have to learn a foreign language, at least to read. Well, this is how Darwin learned German. He knew the New Testament by heart, and so he could learn German from reading it in German. But that's the actual copy. And then this encounter with, the strangeness of native people, and it is striking to him, really, really powerful. These are our brothers, but they're very different from us. Mm-hmm. How do you explain that?
And it really informed, to some degree, his thoughts about racism, mm-hmm. and what was going on in the area that he was from. He had a very different take after. Well,
yeah, I mean, the first place the Beagle hit South America, of course, is Brazil, where there is slavery, mm-hmm. and the family is abolitionists. They're against they're for the abolition of the slave trade in Britain for a long time. It's really part of the family political, religious framework, and it means a lot to Darwin. And so he is appalled by the slavery, the cruelty, etc., what he sees of slavery in Brazil. And yet, in a different way, he gets frightened. Mm-hmm. You can feel it kind of. Why they looked like so many demoniacs who had mm-hmm. been fighting.
Right.
It's a bit of a shock for him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now this takes us out of South America to the Galapagos, where he will encounter the sort of strangeness of island biogeography, and this plant, a tree, obviously. It's an endemic species, genus. That is, the entire genus lives only in the Galapagos, and he knew it was strange when he was there. He was not able to. He couldn't have said that statement. This whole genus lives only here, but he knew it was strange. And one of the strangest things about it, I think you might be able to detect. They're in a different place. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Can you see the sort of flowers off? That corner there, that's sort of a flower. It's a daisy. Have you ever seen a forest of daisies? This is odd stuff. And that's his own collection from Cambridge of that particular plant. So that's
he did a tremendous study of plants. That was, and then he, after he published Origin of the Species, much of his work, in rapid succinction, he did multiple botany books, essentially.
Six books on botany, mm-hmm. and 2 on human beings.
So we think of him editions. As, Origin of the Species, but he really
there's a lot more.
Was incredible. He really, later in his life, became increasingly prolific.
Yes, and that is actually, those are all extensions of the Origin. Those are applied evolution. And many of them, many of those books, the books on orchids, for example, and the book on the expression of emotions in humans are very important in popularizing his theory.
Yes.
They're giving evidence for the way he looks at evolution. That is striking to people.
Yes. I was just going to say, if you think about the evolution of anxiety, the fact that he had that earlier in his life, as sort of a young man, when there was much responsibility and had the loss of his daughter and his father and so on, that's when he had the most difficulty. He was most incapacitated, let's say relative to the rest of his life, did less work, that the anxiety diminished later in life, that he was not as ill. And if it was an illness, you wouldn't expect to see that. You would expect to see a progression of, whatever was going on with his stomach. So he actually became better in a way later in his life. It's almost like he, in a way, came into his own. He became less conflicted about showing his work, about appearing vain, if you will, about owning his theories and his recognition. And in that setting, he becomes even more prolific.
That rings true to me. And the great watershed point is the publication of The Origin. And we know that, I say it rings true to me because it was published in November of 1859. So Darwin has been working on botany sort of in an unorganized way. I mean, fascinating, for 40 years, really a long time. And once The Origin is published, there's enormous battles right outside. He stays away from the battles, but in that spring, he starts 6 books. He does the scientific discovery that underlines these 6 books. In the fields around his house, or in his own garden, relaxed, definitely much more relaxed. And so that...
It's almost like he's uncorked, this great
you can shoot
conflict
me now.
about this discovery, right? And he's now free. He's disinhibited.
Here's the beginning of unfree, if you like. There's a beautiful line in one of his notes from the Beagle on the Galapagos where he's looking back and writing notes that look backwards, and he says, I remember that I had a lot of messages about memory. I can see within sight of each other islands, and yet they would have species that are different, that is of the same genus, different from island to island. And of course, the Galapagos is all volcanic. That's a volcanic island if you ever saw one. All the lava in the front, and the island out there called Kicker, for obvious reasons, Kicker Rock, is also just a collapsed volcano, a volcanic island that came up and collapsed. So
we're going to have to speed through some now, or we won't get to see the rest. So I want to just make sure. So a lot of these are obviously that species he saw, kept his books.
Well, but go back to this is probably where it begins. These 2 birds, mockingbirds, we're questioning their difference because these 2 islands are maybe 100 miles from each other. This one looks exactly like the mockingbirds of South America, and he comments on it. No big deal. The trees are weird, but the birds are the same.
Right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right?
Excuse me. That one, the Chatham Island one, is like the South American one. That's the first island he goes to. Goes to this next island, Charles Island, and it's clearly a mockingbird. But why that different? And that's his thoughts about that really are the first little piece of shreds of his contemplating. He says if the zoology of archipelagos will show this, they will undermine the stability of species, meaning evolution.
I also think, if you think about the incredible observation it takes to note these small details that he notes, he is remarkably vigilant as an observer. And I think that's interesting when you think about anxiety. I mean, people who are anxious are often very vigilant. They are scanning for the next disaster, so to speak, the next shoe to drop, bad thing to happen. And particularly when you have a parent who is highly critical and you don't know when he's going to explode or disapprove, you often find you have children who are vigilant. They're scanning the environment, they're scanning the parent's face for when, the poop's going to hit the fan, as they say. When are things going to turn, and
So
should I skedaddle?
And that transforms into actually
And to
making...
being a vigilant, intense observer,
Yeah.
I think that you often do see that.
Okay.
Yeah. His books.
Erasmus, again, because when he comes back, he opens a notebook, his Transmutation notebooks, in which he will discover, he'll lay out his theory and will ultimately discover natural selection. And the next slide shows this first notebook called the Bee Notebook. And if you go a little bit further, so there was a little glimpse of this, but notice the very first words, the very first word in his notebook is zoonomia, the laws of life. So he sees taking on this grandfather's task in a very, formal way, and begins to lay it out. And there, 36 pages later, he lays out
And
this
it's
tree.
important to know, right, that his father, Robert, admires his father. And so, in terms of pleasing his father, I think, beginning this way, taking on, being the grandfather in a way would be something that might be overly
This is where
determined.
all these manuscripts that we've seen snippets are in Cambridge University. Those are the Darwin papers. That's Charles Lyell.
So he was his disapprover, really. I mean, a colleague, but also didn't approve.
Didn't disagree,
Didn't disagree, but said, meh, essentially. Your your theory
I was
is
just trying to think of Charles Lyell saying meh.
maybe not meh, but your theory is okay.
Right, no, you haven't proven it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that was upsetting to
Definitely.
Darwin. Very upsetting.
Lyell wanted Darwin to publish a book on pigeons. Darwin had been working on pigeons as one example of this whole gigantic theory. And I said, well, if you want to prove your theory, why don't you write a book just on all your pigeon work, and it's concrete and people will get your idea. As a matter of fact, why don't you just put it in a chapter of my book, my next edition of my book.
Right.
There was
And Darwin didn't like conflict, so that was very difficult for him.
Now, but I think, as I said earlier, you have the best exposition of evolution in English is Lyell's translation of Lamarck into his own critical theory. And here is Darwin's marginalia, if you look in the top there, on Lyell. But this is on a copy that he had when he returned from the Beagle. And he says, if this be true, I think, adios theory. Still talking Spanish, back from South America. The other great influence is Malthus, Thomas Robert Malthus, and he has his theory of population, which is Darwin applies immediately directly to understand how competition works in nature, and that's the foundation of his theory of natural selection.
Was it Lyell who basically said all you're doing is reworking Lamarck, essentially? I mean, that was sort of, I think.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, that was also sort of
right.
a bit of a diss. I mean,
definitely, but it's not true. It was untrue.
Right. It wasn't true.
He missed the point.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Or didn't want to accept that point. Yeah. Now this is the page in which Darwin discovers natural selection. I think it's completely illegible from where you're seeing.
Right. Yeah.
But you could see that there's lines between lines written here. It goes over and over again. You see tremendous
reworking.
attention. Reworking.
That's also, again, very vigilant. He reworked his work. He was quite perfectionistic.
But
again,
also
when you think
explosively creative here.
Very creative.
I mean, it's an if you know Darwin's handwriting, it says to you, wow, he's going fast.
Right. He keeps thinking of new ideas, I think. When we talk about genius, certainly creativity would be at the top of the list. He was remarkably innovative, creative, but also this perfectionistic, when you think of kids who are obsessive collectors, very specific, precise, repetitive.
Okay, here is fun. So he goes through writing these notebooks that last from 1837 to 39. By the third notebook, he's got natural selection. Then he waits for 2 years or 3 years until 1842 before writing it up as an essay of 35 pages only. The theory is written up. It's in pencil. And then 2 more years before writing it up substantially, and that's this 1844 essay that you see here, rewritten for him as what they call a fair copy. That could have gone to a publisher. Instead, he puts it under the stairs. And yet, he did show it to the family. We have little pieces signed by Emma with comments saying, quite an assumption. Anything that was religious.
She was also interested in naturalism. I mean, she was somewhat of an interest.
She's kind of the religious enforcer.
Oh.
They disagree.
I thought she also.
Oh yeah,
okay.
she prays for his salvation.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, as she did for her brothers, because the men, I've been hinting, the male line is agnostic to atheistic, and the female line are evangelical, actually. But look at this. See this writing here? Can I even read my own?
Up at the top.
Okay. Is it any trouble for him or to invent or create superintend that he be supposed to delegate it? He must delegate how he works. You don't have the complete quote here, but whoever wrote it is saying, why do you have to demean God this way by making it more, I don't know, deistic? And on the other hand, on the next page, with the very last page, whoops, go back.
Sorry.
This page here, this little snippet. This is written in 1844, but the exact same words are in the very last paragraph of The Origin of Species, a very powerful literary paragraph where he talks about endless forms and being created, how this theory is of general power, and he says endless forms have been, and we have interlined, and are being evolved. Well, those turn out to be, 15 years later, the last words of The Origin. Only problem is that the pencil interlineation, it's not in Darwin's handwriting. It's in the handwriting of his best friend, Joseph Dalton Hooker, who, painted by the same man as Emma and Charles were in their wedding portrait, who is the only scientist that Darwin reveals natural selection to before it's published. Yeah, before he's ready to publish The Origin, already in 1847. So this is just a beautiful place near Darwin House. I mean, I can tell you quite an interesting story about it, but and this is his diary, and there's one little piece in here. You see, it says June 12th, June 14th, pigeons interrupted. So what's that? That's the moment the day in which he received paper by Alfred Russel Wallace independently establishing the theory of natural selection. Darwin was scooped. He's had this since the 1830s, and 1858, someone has already published or sent him a copy of a manuscript to get published. So a tough moment, shall we say.
Yeah.
And there are these two co-founders. We should talk more about Wallace sometime, because this is his bicentenary. Very different social backgrounds, and very different theories in their detail, but in their core, the same. This is a copy of one of the few, 30 remaining pages of The Origin of Species, first edition, handwritten, and again, you can see all the revision. And we've collected them from all over. They were given away by Eddie and her brother. And one of them is here in New York in the museum, American Museum of Natural History. This one comes from, I think it comes from Eton College. Yeah. Next page, okay.
This is a great story.
This is a drawing by Darwin's son, Francis Darwin, we call it the Battle of the Carrot and the Aubergine, for obvious reasons. But it's on the back of one of these pages of The Origin. And the only reason we have that page of The Origin at all is because they kept the kids' drawings. It meant very little to Darwin, just a piece of paper, and the book had been published, etc. So.
It was, I mean, I think part of, this thing, he had this strong thing about being humble, about his humility, and not, placing over much value, and so that really would be, in keeping.
That's very interesting.
His,
Okay, so then we would talk briefly about this botanical side, and these are all orchids of the same orchid studied in the 18th century by this gentleman who got them wrong. I can't go into the detail, but Darwin reinterpreted the orchid and showed that it was an organism for outbreeding, for crossing, rather than for inbreeding, as was thought.
He studied with incredible detail and drew and diagrammed.
Yep. And this is another one of Darwin's loves, which is the insectivorous plants. That's a sundew, a drosera. And those little tentacles grab flies and they eat them or digest them, which Darwin thought was. Now here's a great picture. This is Darwin doing cellular dissections of one of those tips that you just saw, and you see there are 7 pictures. These are essentially as if it were time-lapse photography over, I think it's 12 hours, watching the changes in the cells. It's pretty interesting.
That's perseverance there in your observation, which is another trait that he certainly had.
And pigeons. He was crazy about pigeons. We've established that. And then just a little bit to evoke the status of man at this period. This is Jenny the orang from the London Zoo, who everybody, including Queen Victoria, thought was too human, what did she call it? Displeasingly human. But for Darwin, that was great. I mean, yeah, he could see these connections, these relations, and here's man and gorilla, but skeletalizing, these are his skeleton of pigeons. So man becomes the object, and we were talking about abhorrence of slavery. The Wedgwoods made a Wedgwood plaque that said,
men should do to you, do ye even so to them, right?
Right. Am I not a man and a brother? This is in metal, another version. And you can see how that after the origin was published, am I a man and a brother of the gorilla with the placard, that's from Punch as a critique, as a kind of contemptuous view of what the Darwins have done with the Darwin tradition. This is not Darwin, but a French scientist using Duchenne, right, using electrodes on the muscles of the face to create emotions, or the expression of emotions. Darwin used this in his book called An Expression of Emotions, and it's pretty much like his orchids book. It's a very concrete showing that all the muscles of the human, by which humans express emotions of joy and anger, etc., are prefigured in animals. So it's a powerful, one of those things that Darwin does that gets the question of evolution right up close to us and makes us like that.
So ultimately, he brings us there in his,
He brings us there
in his later
very
works.
concretely this way, yeah.
Brings us there in
And
his later
this is research that continues today, as does the botanical research. People study the same thing that Darwin was interested in climbing plants in space, in a gravity-free environment, to test his theories. It's still going. I did a survey of literature on Darwin, modern literature, from 1979 to the present. There was something like 15,000 articles make serious mention of a specific Darwin scientific observation from this post-origin period. Treat Darwin not just as a flag-waving, okay, Darwin the hero, but actually enter into a kind of dialogue with him as if you were a member of the same scientific research team or seminar.
The hallmark, really, of a genius that still today we are referring to
Yeah.
in such
It's
a
not going to
powerful
last
way.
forever.
Right. Pretty long time, though. Before we get to his death, I want to ask if there are any questions that people wanted to be able to ask about Darwin.
Could you go into the economic background so that people can understand the leisure that he had, so that he'd be able to observe and expound without any
Sure.
That is certainly true.
His economic background, well, he is a scion of the very successful elements in the Midlands of the Industrial Revolution. So he's a Wedgewood, as we said earlier. On the Darwin side, they're doctors, and in fact, the doctors are the bankers of the day. They have cash, and they support the Wedgwoods. So by the time Darwin gets married, Emma has a very large inheritance, and Darwin has a somewhat smaller inheritance. He's an incredible investor. He invests in railroad stock in the American West and does very well. He's picked the apple of the day.
And that's notable because the Wedgwood sons, Emma's brothers, didn't do so well. They invested in things that went poorly, and there were times when the family had to bail them out, and there were great concerns.
It's absolutely true.
So it's true that he had the money to invest, but he did invest wisely, and so he did have the leisure to.
But it does bring, but should we really call it leisure if all you're doing is working? But it is, he's independent. No question. Right. That's right. And this is a time, to put it in further context, when science is moving towards professionalism. And I would not call Darwin a professional scientist, even though the productivity is great. He's on that borderline. He doesn't have to earn a living, but many of the people around him are beginning to have to do that. Like his best friend Hooker, he has to earn a living, and he's the director of Kew Botanical.
Well, it enabled him to go on the HMS Beagle and not be paid,
Yeah, Daddy paid for that.
And just go. On the
It's
one
like going
hand,
to camp, right?
Right.
Right.
And so on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, there are people of the mindset of Darwin who you could describe in some ways as a workaholic, ultimately, who just would have, let their family starve or not had a family. In other words, different people handled it in different ways.
Sure.
He did get to live a very nice life while he observed and so on.
It's definitely part of it. And I think at a deeper level, the way he discusses evolution as a gradual process, almost of a reform, that reflects a political, economic attitude. He's a Whig, he's a liberal in his own time. His family belonged to the Whig Party, English Whig Party, and that's where his sitting in the place, as Sitzenleben is. Yeah.
Would he have suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome? Because his mother died, he discussed that his child died, and his
Right.
father died,
Right.
that he had separation anxiety. Would that be today diagnosed as post-traumatic stress syndrome?
I don't think we would call it that, and the reason I think we wouldn't call it that is that it was sadly very common. In other words, many people lost their parents early, many people lost children, and so it wasn't a completely out of the norm, kind of trauma on the one hand, but I think that it almost doesn't matter in the sense that it's pretty clear that it affected him deeply, and that it worsened whatever anxiety he would have had, and that everything that reminded him of that loss or of separation, he experienced terrible symptoms that you could see with post-traumatic stress disorder, but symptoms of anxiety and depression and psychosomatic problems. So, whether you wouldn't give it that diagnosis per se, but he had the same experiences, recurrent symptoms that limited him at times, really.
And Victorian illness is a kind of social phenomenon of his class.
Yes.
He's not the only guy who's at home.
Right, hysteria, and so to express your anxiety in physical ways was not unusual for that time. And of course, no one talked about
Unlike
anything.
us,
Pre-Freud, no one talked about stiff upper lip, be stoic. And so the idea of to say I'm so sad, I'm so anxious, which did help people ultimately, wasn't done at the time. So instead, it was all sort of very repressed and held in and expressed, physically, maybe with these stomach issues or pains or rashes and so on.
Is there any record of what he responded when he got Wallace's correspondence to him?
There's some. There's a lot of difficulty because Wallace was writing from the Malay archipelago, and so there was a question about when the ship actually delivered the letter. The post delivered the letter, but it seems that he had it for a pretty short period of time, and then said he's got a commission in this letter to get it published, and he carries it out by giving it to Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker to arrange for its publication. And they are very chary to protect his priority, because he has been doing this forever. And by the time he gets this letter, by the way, the origin is an abstract of a longer book that was 3/4 to 85% finished. So he's got a lot done, not a thin little paper. Okay, so they try to protect his priority by digging up something he had written up earlier. So they arrange for a publication, and this is over in the Linnaean Society, of Wallace's paper and Darwin's précis of his theory. This is all done in a few months. Yeah.
Amazing, right?
And there's enough uncertainty for people to say that Darwin cheated, got his ideas from this, but it really doesn't hold water. But it was pretty much, a shock, I would say. And then you can read his diary, exactly when what was interrupted was this long book. You know exactly when he started to convert it into the origin. That's about 3 weeks. Yeah.
So he does live to an old age,
Yep.
76, I think.
That's right.
He lives to, which is, for the time, fairly long. And he is buried in Westminster Abbey, just at his grave, which was, of course, quite an honor. So he was really recognized by the end of his life.
Yeah, well, you consider how controversial from a religious point of view. That tells you something, actually. This is Britain, so he's valued as, even if he is half not Anglican, for what he does for the country, for the nation. Yeah. Old man on a horse. And that's our project.
So if you're
Darwin
interested in
Manuscripts.
seeing the originals.
Well, you won't see the originals, but you'll see 30,000 high-quality scans and transcriptions and notes of these manuscripts.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much.